I'm terrified of what she went through.
So at this point, Samantha she's making coffee.
Imagine for a moment that someone could commit a crime in your city and no one would ever connect them to it. Not because they were lucky, but because they planned it that way, years in advance. In the winter of 2012, the FBI discovered something that made even the most experienced investigators lose sleep. They had caught a serial killer who was so methodical, so calculating, that he buried murder kits across the entire country, waiting patiently like landmines for the day he would return to use them. His name was Israel Keyes, and he might be the most terrifying killer you've never heard of. Our story begins not with a monster, but with a child born on January 7th, 1978, in Richmond, Utah. Israel Keyes was the second of 10 children in a family that would soon take a dark turn away from mainstream society. His parents were members of the Mormon Church initially, but when Israel was just 5 years old, his father moved the entire family to a remote plot of land north of Colville, Washington. Picture this: a one-room cabin with no electricity, no running water, isolated from the world on Rocky Creek Road. The Keyes children were cut off from society, living a life that resembled something from another century. But isolation does strange things to young minds, especially when combined with extreme religious ideology. The family attended a church called the Ark, which followed white supremacist Christian identity beliefs, and later, another church with militia-like connections. For years, some of the children had to sleep in a tent because the cabin was too small, and they were forced to hunt for food and chop firewood just to survive. But young Israel was different from his siblings in ways that would soon become terrifying. By the time he was a teenager, he had grown to 6 feet 2 inches tall, and neighbors began noticing disturbing behaviors. He would shoot at their houses with his BB gun, start fires in the woods, and break into homes. One day, he tied a cat to a tree and shot it with a revolver, laughing as the animal suffered, while other children watched in horror. One girl who knew him said his presence made my skin crawl. Keyes himself would later admit that by age 14, he knew he was different, that the thoughts in his head, the urges he felt, were not normal. I've known since I was 14 that there were things that I thought were normal and that no one else seemed to think were normal, he would tell FBI investigators decades later. He became a loner, hiding his dark nature from everyone around him. His parents discovered stolen guns in his possession and forced him to return them, but it was too late. The damage was already done. Something had broken inside Israel Keyes, or perhaps it was never whole to begin with. When Keyes was in his late teens, his family moved to Maine, where they lived in a mostly Amish community. His mother's religious intensity had reached extreme levels. She forbade her children from learning musical instruments because she believed it was against God, and they had to hide from their parents just to watch movies with friends. Then came the breaking point. After an intense argument, Keyes declared his atheism to his parents, the very people he had spent his entire life trying to please. They evicted him from the house for blasphemy and instructed his younger siblings, who looked up to him, to never have contact with him again. Cast out and alone, Keyes became interested in Satanism and began planning what he intended to be a ritualistic murder. And in the summer of 1997 or 98, he acted on his darkest impulses for the first time. Near Maupin, Oregon, along the Deschutes River, a teenage girl was tubing with her friends when a figure emerged from the tree line. Israel Keyes, then around 19 years old, attacked her with a knife and violently sexually assaulted her. He later told investigators he had planned to murder her as part of a satanic ritual, but at the last moment, he let her go. I was too timid. I wasn't violent enough, he would confess years later, adding chillingly, I made up my mind I was never going to let that happen again. This was the origin of a monster. Seeking structure, or perhaps trying to escape himself, Keyes enlisted in the United States Army in April 1998. He served as a specialist in the infantry, stationed at Fort Lewis and Fort Hood, and even spent time in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. But the military didn't fix what was broken inside him. It may have made it worse. While stationed abroad, he told one fellow soldier that he would like to kill him. During his service, he admitted to attempting to rape a sex worker in Egypt and assaulting a college student he met in Israel. He was a quiet soldier who kept to himself, but on weekends, he drank heavily, consuming entire bottles of wild turkey bourbon. In February 2001, he was even arrested for driving under the influence. Yet despite all these warning signs, he was honorably discharged in 2001 and relocated to Near Bay, Washington, on the Olympic Peninsula. This is where Israel Keyes truly became the killer he was destined to be. According to his own admissions, he began killing in 2001, shortly after leaving the army, but Keyes wasn't like other serial killers you might have heard about. Most serial killers have a type. They target specific kinds of victims, they operate in familiar areas, they leave patterns that investigators can eventually follow. Israel Keyes studied those killers obsessively, reading dozens of books about them, analyzing their mistakes, and he made absolutely certain he would never make those same errors. He read Mindhunter by FBI profiler John Douglas, studying how investigators think. He read Dean Koontz's thriller Intensity multiple times, identifying with the serial killer character. He knew everything about Ted Bundy, whom he idolized, and he studied countless other murderers, learning from their captures. I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about, he would later boast to the FBI. It's kind of a hobby of mine. Here's what made Israel Keyes absolutely terrifying. He had no victim profile, no hunting ground, no pattern at all. He would fly to a random city, sometimes thousands of miles away from his home in Alaska, rent a car using cash, and drive for hours to find a victim. He didn't know who they would be. He didn't care. Man or woman, young or old, it didn't matter. As long as they weren't children or parents of young children, because he had a daughter and claimed this was his one line he wouldn't cross. Though investigators doubted even this. He would turn off his cell phone so it couldn't be traced, pay for everything with cash so there were no credit card records, and he would strike in places where he left almost no evidence behind. But the most disturbing part of his method was something investigators had never seen before in the history of serial murder: the kill kits. Years before he would commit a murder in a particular area, Israel Keyes would travel there and bury caches of supplies. These weren't simple hiding spots, they were carefully prepared arsenals. He would place weapons, ammunition, cash from bank robberies, plastic bags, rope, silencers, and materials to speed up the decomposition of bodies into waterproof buckets, then bury them in remote locations across the entire country. The FBI eventually recovered caches in Eagle River, Alaska, and near Blake Falls Reservoir in Parishville, New York. But Keyes hinted at many more in places like Wyoming, Washington, and beyond. Think about the patience this required, the cold calculation. He would visit a state as a tourist, find the perfect isolated spot, bury his murder supplies, and then leave. Sometimes waiting years before returning to kill. When he finally came back to claim a victim, everything he needed was already waiting for him, untraceable and ready to use. He could commit murder and vanish like a ghost, leaving investigators with crime scenes that pointed nowhere because the killer had no connection whatsoever to the area or the victim. The FBI believes Israel Keyes killed at least 11 people, though he hinted at more. Between 2005 and 2006, he told investigators he killed 2 separate victims in Washington state, disposing of at least one body in Lake Crescent. He admitted to another double homicide of a young couple somewhere in Washington between 2001 and 2005, killing the man with a shovel and strangling the woman, then burying both bodies in locations that have never been found. In April 2009, he kidnapped a woman from New Jersey, transported her across state lines, and buried her body near Tupper Lake in upstate New York. The FBI believes this victim was 48-year-old Deborah Feldman, who disappeared from Hackensack on April 8, 2009. When investigators showed Keyes her photograph during questioning, he paused for several long seconds before saying coldly, I don't want to talk about her yet. The next day, he robbed a bank in Tupper Lake, likely to fund his trip home, then disappeared back to Alaska, as if he'd never been there. But his most confirmed and carefully documented murders were those of Bill and Lorraine Currier and Samantha Koenig. In June 2011, Keyes flew from Alaska to Chicago, rented a car, and drove 1,000 miles to Essex, Vermont. 2 years earlier, he had buried a murder kit near this quiet community, and now he had returned to use it. On the night of June 8th, he broke into the home of Bill Currier, age 49, and his wife Lorraine, 55. He tied them up and forced them into his rental car, then drove them to an abandoned farmhouse. There, he shot Bill Currier in the head and sexually assaulted Lorraine before strangling her to death. Their bodies have never been found, and to this day, Bill and Lorraine Currier remain missing, though everyone knows they're gone. Keyes then calmly moved most of his kill kit to a new hiding place in New York for future use and flew back to Alaska. For nearly a year, no one had any idea he was responsible, because there was absolutely no connection between a contractor in Alaska and a middle-aged couple in Vermont. Then came his final victim, the one who would ultimately lead to his capture. Her name was Samantha Koenig, and she was just 18 years old, working at a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska, to earn money for college. On the evening of February 1st, 2012, a man approached the Common Grounds coffee booth on Tudor Road. Security cameras captured what happened next. The man, wearing a dark hood, pulled out a gun and forced Samantha to turn off the lights and come outside. He zip-tied her hands, put her in his white pickup truck, parked across the street, and drove away. That man was Israel Keyes, and for the first time in his killing career, he had murdered close to home, breaking his own carefully established rules. What Keyes did to Samantha Koenig is almost too horrible to describe, but it must be told because it reveals the true depth of his evil. He took her to his house and sexually assaulted her repeatedly, then strangled her to death with a rope. But Keyes had already planned a 2-week cruise vacation with his girlfriend and daughter. So he did something unthinkable. He left Samantha's body in a shed in his backyard and went on the cruise as if nothing had happened. For 2 weeks, he smiled for family photos and enjoyed the Caribbean sun, while Samantha Koenig's body lay frozen in that shed. When he returned to Anchorage on February 18th, he went to the shed and sexually assaulted her corpse. Then, in a display of twisted cruelty, he applied makeup to her face and sewed her eyelids open with fishing line to make her appear alive. He positioned her body with a recent newspaper and took a photograph, which he planned to use to make her family believe she was still alive. He then sent a ransom note demanding $30,000, with some of the money to be deposited into Samantha's bank account. This ransom demand was Israel Keyes' fatal mistake. After collecting some of the money, he dismembered Samantha Koenig's body and disposed of it in Matanuska Lake, north of Anchorage, where it was later recovered by the FBI's Underwater Search and Evidence Response Team. But Keyes had kept Samantha's debit card and cell phone, and as he traveled across the country in February and early March 2012, he began using her card at ATM machines. The FBI tracked every withdrawal, watching as the transactions moved from Alaska to Arizona to New Mexico to Texas. They issued a bulletin for his rental car, and on the morning of March 13th, 2012, Texas Highway Patrol and Texas Rangers spotted Keyes in the parking lot of a cafe in Lufkin, Texas. They stopped him for driving slightly over the speed limit, searched his vehicle, and found Samantha's ATM card and phone, along with cash stained with bright ink from a bank robbery. Israel Keyes, the ghost who had haunted America for over a decade, was finally in custody. At first, Keyes tried to lie, claiming someone had tossed Samantha's belongings into his car through an open window. But when confronted with the evidence, he began to talk. Over the next several months, FBI agents conducted more than 40 hours of interviews with him. What emerged was a portrait of a man who enjoyed being two different people. The friendly contractor and trustworthy neighbor on one side, and the remorseless killer on the other. There is no one who knows me, or who has ever known me, who knows anything about me really, he told investigators with obvious pride. They're going to tell you something that does not line up with anything I tell you, because I'm two different people, basically. He confessed to some murders, hinted at others, and played psychological games with the agents, revealing just enough to keep them interested, but never giving them everything they wanted. He wanted the death penalty quickly. He didn't want trials in multiple jurisdictions, didn't want media attention, and he especially didn't want his young daughter to find out what kind of monster her father truly was. But Israel Keyes would never face trial. On the night of December 1st, 2012, while being held in the Anchorage Correctional Complex, he managed to conceal a razor blade in his cell. Investigators still don't know how he obtained it. He cut his wrists and strangled himself with a rolled-up bedsheet, dying by suicide. Under his body, investigators found a suicide note, a disturbing ode to murder, written in pencil and ink on yellow legal paper, soaked in blood. The note offered no clues about additional victims, just cryptic ramblings about death and killing. But the most chilling discovery came when they searched his cell more thoroughly. Drawn in his own blood on paper hidden beneath his bed were 11 skulls and 1 pentagram. The FBI believes each skull represents one of his victims. To this day, several of those 11 victims have never been identified. Somewhere in America, there are families still waiting to find out what happened to their loved ones, never knowing that Israel Keyes buried them in unmarked graves or submerged them in remote lakes decades ago. The case of Israel Keyes forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil. We like to believe that monsters reveal themselves, that their darkness is visible if we just look closely enough. But Keyes was a master of deception. His co-workers thought he was skilled and trustworthy, though a few female clients reported brief facial expressions that made them uncomfortable. Moments when the mask slipped, just for an instant, before he composed himself again. He had a girlfriend, a daughter he loved, friends who never suspected anything. He went to work, paid his bills, and seemed like a regular person. But in reality, he was studying serial killers like other people study sports statistics, planning murders years in advance, and traveling thousands of miles to kill complete strangers for no reason other than the pleasure it gave him. When asked why he killed, he simply said he enjoyed it, that he had no remorse at all, and that if he hadn't been caught, he would have continued until he was too old to do it anymore. FBI Special Agent Jolene Gordon, who conducted many of the interviews with Keyes, said something that should chill everyone to the bone.
He talked about enjoying the fact that he was two different people and really being able to play that off with people, and that people had absolutely no idea what he was doing.
Keyes was very meticulous. His crimes were very well thought out. There was nothing that was spur of the moment. Everything was meticulously planned, and our interviews with him were the same from his standpoint. I never got the sense that he accidentally told us something. My sense was that he knew every time he came in kind of what he was going to give us that day. Even in captivity, he was still in control, still playing his game, right up until the moment he decided to end it. And when he took his own life, he took with him the locations of bodies, the names of victims, and the full scope of his crimes. Those secrets are buried with him now, scattered across the country in hidden graves that may never be found. The FBI released an interactive timeline of Keyes' travels and movements, showing the thousands of miles he covered, the rental cars he used, the hotels he stayed in, the flights he took, and the places he visited. Looking at that timeline is like watching a spider build a web across an entire continent. From Washington to Vermont, from Alaska to Florida, from Texas to New York, he moved constantly, hunting, killing, and vanishing. The map of his movements overlaps with dozens of unsolved missing persons cases and murders, and investigators have spent years trying to connect him to these open cases using his DNA and travel records. Some connections have been ruled out, but others remain possibilities, lingering questions that may never be answered. Was he responsible for the murder of Randy Gorenberg in Boca Raton, Florida in 2007? What about Nancy Bacicchio and her 7-year-old daughter? Shot in that same town later that year. Keyes was in Florida during those times, but no definitive link has ever been established. Did he kill 12-year-old Julie Harris in Colville, Washington, back in 1996 when he was just 18? When asked about her case, he simply said he'd heard about that, neither confirming nor denying involvement. These questions haunt investigators still. In the end, what makes Israel Keyes one of the most terrifying serial killers in modern history isn't just the number of people he killed, though that number is horrifying enough. It's the realization that he represented a new breed of killer, one who learned from the mistakes of those who came before him, who used modern technology and transportation to his advantage, and who understood that randomness was his greatest weapon. He called Dennis Rader the BTK killer, a wimp for apologizing in court. He idolized killers that haven't been caught, and for over a decade, he was one of them, the uncatchable ghost, moving through America's cities and towns like a shadow, leaving death in his wake. If he hadn't broken his own rule and killed Samantha Koenig in his home territory, if he hadn't kept her debit card as a trophy, he might still be out there today. The story of Israel Keyes teaches us that evil doesn't always look like the monsters in movies. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor, your contractor, the quiet guy at work who keeps to himself. Sometimes it plans its crimes years in advance, burying weapons in forests and waiting patiently for the right moment. Sometimes it studies and learns and adapts, always staying one step ahead. And sometimes, even after it's caught, it continues to haunt us with unanswered questions and undiscovered graves. Somewhere in America, there are places where the earth holds secrets that Israel Keyes took to his grave. Victims whose families still wait for answers that will never come, because the only person who knew the truth decided his silence was more valuable than their closure. That might be the most disturbing part of this entire nightmare. That even in death, Israel Keyes won, keeping his secrets forever and leaving behind nothing but blood-drawn skulls on paper and a legacy of terror that continues to this day. If there's a lesson in this darkness, it's that we must remain vigilant, that we must look out for one another, because somewhere out there, another Israel Keyes might be planning, waiting, and burying his tools, preparing for a day of horror that none of us can predict. And that thought should keep us all awake at night. Sometimes, destruction isn't caused by violence, but by ambition. Click the video on your screen to see how a $2.3 billion dream became a massive failure.